The Black Death, a deadly pandemic. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. It swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people. That was nearly one-third of Europe's population at the time. The plague didn't just affect people physically. It shook the foundations of society, causing fear, panic, and significant social, economic, and religious changes. Origins and spread of the plague. The disease is believed to have originated in Central Asia, possibly in Mongolia or China, before spreading through trade routes. The infamous Silk Road and maritime trade routes carried the deadly bacteria, Yersinia pestis, to Europe. The plague arrived in Europe around 1347, when ships from the Black Sea port of Caffa docked in Sicily. On board were not just sailors, but rats, and with them, fleas carrying the deadly bacterium. The infected fleas would bite humans, spreading the disease in the process. Terrifying symptoms and rapid death. The symptoms were brutal and terrifying. Victims would first experience fever, chills, and headaches. Then, swollen lymph nodes, known as buboes, would appear, which is why the disease became known as the bubonic plague. These painful lumps would often ooze pus or blood, and within days, many of the infected would die. In some cases, the plague also took on a more virulent form known as the pneumonic plague, which spread through the air and infected the lungs, making it even deadlier. Medieval responses and misunderstandings. Medieval Europe had no understanding of germs or bacteria, and people were at a loss about how to deal with the plague. Some thought it was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Others blamed minority groups, particularly the Jewish communities, leading to persecution and violence. People tried all sorts of remedies, from bloodletting to burning aromatic herbs. But nothing seemed to stop the plague from spreading. Entire towns and villages were wiped out. The social and economic impact. The societal impact of the Black Death was immense. With so many people dying, labor became scarce. Wages for workers rose. And the feudal system, which had governed much of Europe, began to weaken. The plague also had a deep psychological impact. The fear of death became a constant presence, and it's said that people became more obsessed with their own mortality. This era gave rise to macabre art, such as the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, which portrayed skeletons dancing with the living as a reminder of death's inevitability. Trade and the speed of the spread. The Black Death traveled incredibly fast, thanks to Europe's extensive trade network, especially in bustling ports like Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. Ships filled with goods also carried infected rats and fleas. As these ships docked, they unknowingly spread the disease further, from port to port and eventually inland. Even the wealthy and those in power couldn't escape the reach of the plague. Attempts at containment. Cities and towns tried to contain the spread of the disease by imposing quarantines. The word itself comes from 40 giorni, Italian for 40 days, which was the amount of time ships had to wait in port to ensure no one aboard was infected. However, these measures were often too late and not fully effective. Many cities turned into ghost towns as the dead outnumbered the living. Impact on the Church. The Catholic Church, a powerful force in medieval life, struggled to maintain its influence during the plague. With so many priests and clergy members dying, many questioned the Church's ability to protect the faithful. In some regions, the Church's failure to provide comfort or answers led to a rise in radical movements, such as the Flagellants, who believed the plague was God's punishment and sought forgiveness through extreme self-punishment. Transformation of medicine. The Black Death changed medicine forever. Before the plague, much of medicine was based on superstition and religious beliefs. After the plague, however, more doctors began to study medicine scientifically. Autopsies, once forbidden by the Church, were now seen as a necessary tool to understand diseases. The plague sparked a slow but significant transformation towards modern medical practices. The long-term effects on Europe. While the plague itself was devastating, It also had long-term effects on European society. With fewer people to work the land, serfs gained more power. Some were even able to negotiate better conditions or wages. The weakened feudal system began to crumble, leading to the rise of a more modern economy. The Black Death also led to significant advances in hygiene and urban planning, as people sought to prevent another disaster of this magnitude. Religious unrest and long-lasting effects. Religiously, the Black Death caused many to question their faith. Some believed that the church had failed to protect them, and in some areas, religious movements like flagellants emerged. Groups of people who whipped themselves publicly in the hope of appeasing an angry God. Eventually, the pandemic faded, though the plague would return in waves over the centuries. The initial outbreak, however, left an indelible mark on history. It forever changed the course of Europe, and reminded humanity of how vulnerable we are to the unseen forces of nature. If this historical journey intrigued you, make sure to subscribe to Whimsy Stories for more fascinating tales from the pages of history.